Welcome to the Relationship Manifesto. We're on episode 8 now in the podcast series, which coincides with chapter 7 in the book, and I'm still very confused about all of this, but hopefully you as a listener will know what's going on, maybe more than I do. And I'm Chris Smith, Shambles Guru, and I'm here with Stephen Whitehead, the academic author, relationship coach and researcher. And so we're going to spend the next 30 minutes talking about chapter 7, which is entitled, I'm hesitant about this one because I'm not sure if I can handle it, but the chapter title is, What is your problem with sex? Stephen, you ready for this one?
I'm always ready for this one.
Oh God, he has these answers, right? I'm always ready for this one. Okay, do you have your 60-second elevator pitch?
I'll give it a go. Most relationships come to grief over sex than any other single factor. Sex bedevils us. It bedevils relationships. It causes grief, unhappiness, guilt, shame, anxiety. And yet it also causes and creates great pleasure. And it can be the most important bond in a relationship. In fact, you might argue that it's impossible to have a full intimate relationship without that sexual dimension. Not that I necessarily agree with that, but the point is that sex is key, but it's also highly problematic. And in this chapter, I'm going to go into some of the reasons why it's problematic and how we might overcome these difficulties.
Okay, so what is your problem with sex? Before you get into it, though, I'm curious is why you said, what is your problem with sex, rather than what are your celebrations with sex? Was there a rationale behind that?
Yeah, because simply in the title, I want people to reflect on how they see sex. We have and I'm talking globally here. I'm talking about humanity. Most societies are dysfunctional when it comes to sexuality. They see sex primarily in negative terms. Cultures, societies, over time, have not always been like this, but they certainly are like this today. And we have very narrow and limited views on sex and sexuality. And we also have an acute lack of understanding about the joys of sex and the complexities of sexuality and sexual identity. We're fearful of it. Societies like the US are typical of this, highly conservative, and yet ridden with a massive sex industry, certainly through pornography, greater incidence of people experimenting with sex, having different partners, but all in this large landscape of anxiety, guilt, shame, and negative judgment. That's why the title is, What is your problem with sex? I want people to reflect on what it might be and how they can overcome that in order to have a longer lasting relationship.
So the book in the chapter, is it a series of bullet points on this, and you can just go through and tick them, or is it more? Is it more vague?
I'll keep the bullet points so when I do a lecture on it, and my students from around the world who've done the lectures on this, the bullet points work. But no, in the book there will be some bullet points, but basically it's more what we call discursive. I'm getting into a discussion about it. Hopefully the discussion will resonate with people's lived experiences, their own lives, their own relationships.
And actually, before you really get into the nitty-gritty, and listeners are going, I wish Chris would shut up, but I'm not for a second now, is just a reminder that how much of what you're saying now is just a personal viewpoint and how much is based on experience and research.
In anything like this, you can never remove your own personal viewpoint from it. So I'm not going to claim that this is entirely an objective, scientifically driven process. It's not like that, and no sociology really is. So it's informed by my own experiences, my own interpretations, what I've seen, heard and done, but also very clearly from talking to people, listening to people, researching people. This is sex is there's a massive amount of literature now on this around the world, and ongoing research. not just in the West but also around the world, on sex and sexuality, and how it's changing over at this beginning of this century. But the undercurrent theme, the recurring theme that we keep coming back to, is that we fail to be grown up about sex, and especially about our own sexuality. We invest so much in sex, and yet we can never wholly control it. So these are some of the big issues that I'm touching on in the book.
Okay, so tell us a bit about the chapter. How does it start off, and where does it go?
Well, I want to recognise that, first and foremost, that sexuality is a powerful drive in each of us. And so long as we pretend we can control it by simply saying, I do, or I love you, then we're always going to be picking up the pieces some years later. You cannot simply put a blanket on your sexual desires because you love someone or because you've committed to them long term. I think one of the difficulties now we have with long-term relationships, not just marriage but also all long-term relationships, is they're built around the myth of monogamy. Most people cannot be monogamous. In fact, I would go as far as to say monogamy is not even natural. It's not even healthy. It's okay for a small minority of people, but for most people, no. And certainly not monogamy over 20, 30, 40 years. Maybe monogamy for 5 years, 10 years, okay. But beyond that, it's very, very difficult. So we've got long-term relationships which are built on a myth. The myth that being men and women, we can control our sexual needs through either guilt or fear or through commitment and love for our partner. But this is a really dangerous delusion. Most of us can't do this. And in trying to do it, it creates psychological damage. It creates emotional breakups. It creates physical breakups in the relationship. So what I'm exploring is the way in which we can overcome the monogamy myth, but in a way which is not damaging for relationships. There are many couples around the world now doing this.
But how can it be a myth? Because for the last 2 centuries, people have modelled this monogamy approach, haven't they?
Yeah, painfully.
You think it's painful, even if you went back? Let's say they go back to the sort of Victorian times, or
yeah, sure.
And do you think it was painful then?
Oh, sure. There were more prostitutes in London in Victorian times than there are in Bangkok today.
Really?
Absolutely. The Victorian men were going out and having paid sex in droves, while the middle class Victorian women were presumed to be lying back and thinking of England every time they had sex with their husband. It's just part of the myths. There's some indicators. I mean, the indicators are very significant. We've got more sex work and prostitution now around the world. We've got an increase in pornography. That's a massive industry now. I'll come back to pornography in a moment. We've got teenagers having sex quite commonly at 15 around the world in developed and developed countries. And in the US, for example, by the time a man or woman's got to the age of 21, they've had an average of 4 sexual partners. And they'll go on and have many more during the course of their life. We're living in a world where sex is all around us, but we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to explore it or understand it. And it's deemed unhealthy to do that. Coming back onto pornography, for me this is an indicator of how sex has become secret, prurient and driven by lust and desire, but also contaminated by secrecy, shame and guilt. When people are in healthy, active, passionate and regular sex lifestyles, they don't need pornography. Okay, I'm not saying porn can't have its uses, and that's fine, but we've gotten obsessed with sex and the voyeurism of it all. We'd be much better off having more physical sex, maybe with more partners, and watching less porn on our own. There's lots of married couples now where pornography's got in the way of their sexual lifestyle. The guy or the woman, they're either watching porn, often through the internet, or they're on social networking sites like Facebook, and they're investing in some surreptitious flirting with some other person in some other part of the world as a form of titillation, but that's not being reinvested in their own physical relationships with each other. So we've got this obsession with it, but it's surrounded by guilt and secrecy. one of the consequences of this now is the increasing levels of teenage pregnancies. The UK's got the highest level in Europe, which is 30 per thousand. The US has got the highest in the developed world, which is 52 per thousand. But now Thailand's got the highest level of teenage pregnancies in Asia, which is 70 per thousand. And, you know, we're looking at a country like Thailand, which is, as you well know, is an innately conservative, traditional country. But the evidence that's coming in, the research that's being done, shows that even here in this country, young men and women are having sex from the age of about 16. And that's
figures,
here.
But those figures, are they illustrating the increased amount of sex, or are they illustrating a lack of education in birth control?
Well, there's a lack of education in birth control, and that's often indicative of a lack of openness in society, an unwillingness to discuss birth control and discuss sex and sexuality in society in order to have a proper debate about sex education and educating the younger generation about sex. You need to be open about it.
Yes.
And it's, you know, when you've got a country like the United States, and it's got so many high teenage pregnancies, and yet it's also a country where there's a phenomenal multi-billion-dollar sex industry. Something is amiss. We've got, on the one side, we've got all this commercial activity, the commodification of sex, and yet on the other side we've got phenomenal secrecy attached to it. It's a complicated situation. At the same time, what I'm also seeing, what's coming out from research, again in the States, is that there are some ways forward. Come back to monogamy. Monogamy, for me, I see monogamy as a problem, because I think for most people they can't be monogamous, and it's you know, it's trying to put a square peg in a round hole to force a relationship, force two people to be monogamous for a long period of time. It's the gay marriages, gay relationships are signalling some important changes here. And there was research done, a 3-year study done by San Francisco State University, which completed recently. Now, this study surveyed 556 gay couples,
yes,
and over 3 years, and it found that 50% of these relationships were open. They were
sorry, open between each other in the relationship, or open with the world?
No, they were open. They're open with the world. There were relationships that were open, but they were open in terms of sexuality. So what you had by open, I mean that these were gay men and also lesbian women who were obviously in same-sex relationships, but they were having sex with other partners, but they were doing so with the knowledge and consent of both parties. And now this was interesting, because these are committed relationships, but which have renegotiated the meaning of commitment. They don't use the term infidelity. They don't use the concept of cheating. They don't use the concept of affairs. And what the study also found, and there's other research that supports this, that these sorts of relationships, including same-sex marriages, they're lasting longer than those that were not open. Now, straight couples, they call it affairs and cheating, but many gay couples now don't apply this sort of negativity to sex outside marriage or sex outside the relationship.
Is there any semantics? Do they what would they call it? If it's, you know,
they'll call it what they want. I mean, it's people, they'll negotiate it for themselves. Basically the term that's used by sociologists is an open relationship.
Yes.
And it's there are many heterosexual couples that have open relationships. I mean, there's an increase in this now around the world, but it's slow, and it's often done in a secretive way because of the social pressure and the stigma attached to this sort of activity.
Okay, I interrupted then. I'll let you get back into the flow of it.
Well, what we're seeing, and I want to place this change, this dramatic change, in the concept where marriage is actually in crisis. And that's why I'm saying we need a new approach. And just given the incidence of research that's been done with gay marriages, they're signalling this new perspective. If we don't change, marriage is going to die out. Because in the next podcast, I'm going to talk about changing women and the way in which changing women are not going into marriage in great numbers as they used to. So we need a new and innovative way to look at relationships and marriage in particular. And
we're not going to survive. What do you mean by we're not?
Marriage isn't going to survive.
Marriage isn't going to survive.
Marriage isn't going to survive. Yeah, and we need to move beyond the old-fashioned ideas of monogamy and having one sexual partner throughout all our lives. And most of us don't live like this. And I say I don't even think that monogamy for many people is even natural. So we need to evolve into 21st century way of being in relationships if they're going to last. We're living 21st century lives, but when it comes to sexuality, we're trying to live relationships which reflect lives and lifestyles of 100 years ago.
People don't change quickly, though, do they? Human beings are pretty, or are they? I don't know.
I think they change rapidly. And they can adapt quickly. 2,000 years is a long time in human history, as we know, but things can change within a decade, and they are doing. Look at how the world's changed since the end of the Second World War. And we're not just talking about technology and advances in that way, but the way in which people are living their lives. Having said that, it is true to say that gender relationships have been slower to change, and I think men have been slower to change. Again, that's another podcast, but they are changing.
Yes.
And we are at a very interesting point now, at the beginning of the 21st century, when we're seeing new types of families, new types of relationships, more experimentation. I mean, who would have thought that 100 years ago you'd have had such a great incidence of open gay marriages? I think it's wonderful, and it's very important, and it's indicative of a freeing up and a loosening up of the old sexual chains that it bound our minds. So if you just staying with gay sex for the time being, it was you look at the UK, we were locking up consenting gay men, putting them in prison. We were putting young gay men, I'm saying young 16, 17, 18-year-old, who were classified as in those back in the 40s or 50s as non-consenting adults. We're putting them in mental homes. So we've moved on, and all that's great. That's very positive. But there's still a lot of.
And this changed when? When did that? In the UK, we're talking about then. When did that change? Because there were certain dates, were there not?
Well, yeah, the 60s saw the middle 60s, 1960s saw the removal of criminalisation of gay sex between consenting adults, but it didn't. Gay sex between men didn't come down to a similar age for heterosexual sex which is about 16 until the 1990s. But there's massive social shift. But then again, you still got reactions against it around the world. You can, if you're gay in some parts of Africa, Uganda, for example, it can be a virtual death sentence. Certainly, if you come out as a gay man. So I look to the gay community particularly because I think they can be the forerunners of positive change in society. I think we need to look more at the way in which gay couples are acting and creating their own new forms of relationships outside of this code of what sociologists call this compulsory heterosexuality, where everybody's got to be straight. Clearly nobody is, and it's just as well we're not all straight. I mean, viva la difference. But gay couples are more like to challenge these social codes, but at the same time, the evidence also shows that they're having longer lasting relationships as well.
So the gay couples are doing this sort of advanced research on the model which heterosexuals may benefit from in the future.
I think so. But then there's many heterosexuals doing the same thing as well. You look at the incidence of swinging clubs. The swinging clubs all over the world now, and you go into those swinging clubs for which is predominantly for swinging clubs for straights. There's many or most of the couples in those who partaking of this are they're in long-term relationships. So what's the problem? They've come to some negotiation, accommodation. They're doing it in a way which is suits them. Is it wrong? No. Is it bad? No. Is it different? Yeah, it's different for many people's or most people's lifestyles, but it's increasingly common.
Yes.
And if that works, it is a way of keeping that relationship together. And I've seen so much of this, where people are open, they're having other partners, but in a way which is consensual between both parties. Then it's a strengthener. It doesn't have to break up a relationship.
Yes. I clearly am feeling a little bit out of my depth on this, and I suspect after this podcast I'm going to interrogate my good friend called Google and look a few of these key phrases up and find out where all the swinging clubs are. But
actually, interestingly enough, there's none. There's none in Thailand.
Really?
You won't find them in Thailand. Why isn't there any in Thailand? Because Thailand, in a way, the whole country is swinging. Anybody who lives out here in Thailand knows that it's a very sexualized culture. I give listeners an example of that. Those who don't know Thailand personally, there's sex establishments all over the country, not just in Bangkok and Pattaya, and it's estimated that some 450,000 Thai men a day visit a sex worker.
So nearly 500,000.
Yeah, a day.
A day.
A day. Yeah. Link that with the fact that Thailand's got somewhere between 12 and 14 million tourists a year, half of whom are single men. Those single men, whether gay or straight, are coming out here for fun. They're coming out here for pleasure, sexual pleasure, and it's not difficult to find it. So you've got a massive industry, and it's not just here in Thailand. You see the same across Southeast Asia. You see, globalization's driven this, and it's exposing human need. I'll give you another example. Would be the Caribbean and West Africa, countries like Gambia. Now, Gambia's a small country, but it's got its own particular sex industry. That's not one that's driven predominantly by men paying for sex with women, but women paying for sex with men.
Really?
Yeah, and the women clients are Western women. It's highly common in West Africa, and it's highly common in the Caribbean. Now, I know that this is driven by an economic imperative, the desire for money, but it's that aside. We're clearly what's interesting about the Gambian phenomenon is that it's exposing the fact that many older women from the West are very willing to pay for sex with a man. They just need to find the right society or culture or location for it, and some countries are now offering this, and it's becoming totally acceptable in those countries. And so sex works, prostitution, call it what you will. It's just one dimension of which it's something when a sociologist looks at it, it just reveals the variety of sexual dynamics that's going on in society, which is quite fascinating, really.
So, but all of this is an indicator of the transition you see we're going through away from marriage to other types of relationships. Is that right?
Yeah, we're at the beginning of this now, but what we've moved to is let's get it in perspective. We've got a decline in marriage. We've got an increase in the number of relationships that people are in over the course of a lifetime. We're living longer. We've got strong sexual desires. We've got the opportunity for more sex around us. And women are more likely to be opportunistic or confident in expressing the sexuality and asking for sex and looking for sex than they would have been in the past. We've got globalization. We've got the opportunity for travel, to meet new cultures, people in new cultures. We've got the opportunity to experiment, and we've got the internet.
Yes.
You put all this together at the beginning of the 21st century. It's no wonder that marriage is struggling. It's no longer wonder that long-term relationships are struggling, because they have to adapt to this new reality. So just for listeners just to understand, we've got on one side, we've got all this phenomenal change, much of which I have to say from a personal perspective, I think it's healthy. But then on the other side, we've got this continued adherence to the concept of marriage and the institution of marriage, which requires lifetime happy ever after love with one partner. It doesn't work.
Wait, let me put a plea in for that group. let me ask a bit. There's a whole generation out there of mums and dads, of mums and dads now, whose dream is that their children are going to grow up, get a good job, get married, have children, and they're going to become grandparents. It doesn't sound good news for that group of people.
Well, if we leave out the marriage bit, there's no reason why they won't become grandparents, and there's no reason why their children won't have children, but they won't have so many. But it is a different world. I say I'm not creating it. Don't people out there blame it on Stephen Whitehead. I'm not. It's not my responsibility. All I'm doing, I'm contributing it in my own way, of course, but all I'm doing is highlighting it. I'm telling it like it is. And if people can turn around and say, well, I'm sorry, it's not like that, it's totally different. Well, I'm sorry, you're wrong. You might be able to say it's totally different for you, and that's fine, but you're one person.
Yes.
I'm talking about social phenomena which is out there, it's evident, and it's getting bigger. It's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. And as far as the mums and dads who are hoping that their little Johnny or Jenny is going to, go off and get married and procreate. Ask people out there one question: how many of your married friends are having or had affairs or secret liaisons? Absolutely many, and probably more than you realise. And I'm not even going to ask you if you had an affair or your partner's had an affair. Only you know that, and that's your business. But the point,
I should say, listen, he's talking to you, not to me.
Yeah, I'm talking to you. Yes. But I'm saying to people, don't feel bad or guilty. This goes on everywhere, but we just don't like to admit it. We're trapped between what we feel is expected of us and what we feel emotionally and sexually deep inside. The result is oceans of unmitigated guilt and pain. We've got marriage counsellors dealing with this all the time. We've even got the very dubious concept of sex addiction. We've got people like Tiger Woods and Michael Douglas, the actor Michael Douglas, having to go through this sort of rather dodgy process of counselling themselves away from sex addiction. These are all judgments. I mean, what is normal? And believe me, you once you start doing research and looking at this, one thing you don't do as a sociologist, you don't start classifying anything as normal. You might see patterns which are repeated in many places, but normality itself is a dangerous concept to start putting on people.
So that's a dangerous question there. Right? So if I said to you, Stephen, am I normal? The question actually has no meaning.
It has no
from
meaning,
what you just said, right?
What you're comparing it against, because there's only one, in your case, only one Chris Smith, that you're unique. What would we look at in terms of your life, which corresponds with the rest of the population? It's not as simple as that.
Yes.
Cultures are very different. Societies develop very different. Communities are very different. Families are very different. 6.5 billion people, every one of them is different. So we are caught in this world of diversity and multiplicity. But and I don't even think that, as I've said before, I don't even think that sex is the overwhelming urge. I think it's important, and it's something we all will have. But it's often the desire for intimacy and love is more important to us. We're seeking that. Now, if you've got a love relationship and you have a close intimacy with your partner, a loving relationship, then don't avoid conversations about sex. Because if you do, the sex dynamic, the energy of sexuality with one or both of you can, if it's not channeled productively, can get in the way and break up the relationship. Now, if it means one of you wanting to go off and have sex with someone else, then I think that's entirely healthy. But it only works if there's consent and openness. If it's built around deceit and lies, then it's absolutely deadly.
Yes.
The relationship will certainly flounder. But if it's done openly, and that's again another podcast about being open and honest in relationships. The bottom line is, very few of us can have sex with only one person for decade after decade. You don't. It's just not. Some people can, some couples can and do, and that's fine for them. But to expect everybody to do it,
yes,
no way. The truth is this. Actually, this is a truth that virtually every man knows, though few will ever admit it, and certainly not to the wife or partner. And I know many women will say that they cannot have sex with someone they don't love. I've heard that statement so many times. It's not true.
Really?
Absolutely. Women can have sex for pleasure. And ultimately, sex comes... There's two aspects of sex. One is the pleasure, one is the intimacy. You can have sex for pleasure, and people do. And then you can have sex for intimacy. And interestingly enough, a lot of the research that's shown on sex work and people who pay for sex, they're often looking for intimacy more than they're looking for pleasure. But women who say they can't have sex with anyone they don't love, for some women that will be the case, and I'm not denying that. But for many, many women, for millions of women, it's not the case. Sure, that women can have sex for pleasure just like men can, and increasingly they are doing. You know, I said earlier, you've got an average in the US alone, an average of average of women at the age of 20, 21 have got four sexual partners by the time they reach that age. You've got 15 and 16-year-olds having sex. Is that for love? No. It's for pleasure, it's for curiosity, it's for experimentation. Holding on to this sexual ideal of monogamy, and you know, sex with one person for a lifetime, it's always been problematic, but in the 21st century, when people travel and communicate so much more, it's become a major issue in relationships.
Yes. Can I ask something about the pressures from advertising? You hear the term sex sells. So and when we have we're completely surrounded whenever you switch on the TV,
sure.
Whenever you look on the internet,
yeah.
There's advertising and pressure there saying, you know, buy our products, you'll
Yeah.
have sex, you're more likely to meet somebody, you'll be more attractive to the opposite sex. But those advertising agencies tend to be encouraging, and this is a question, I guess, encouraging the stereotypes. So they're trying to encourage something that you're saying is not doable. Is that right?
Well, they're encouraging. Well, for one thing, the stereotyping in the media often objectifies both men and women sexually. That's one thing, and it also helps create this sexualized culture. But it doesn't do much to help us understand it or live in it in an open way. So on one side, you've got the constant, as you say, bombardment in our minds, imaginations, of sexual imagery, and yet we've got very little openness between people about sex and sexuality. One of the crucial areas where there's a lack of openness is between parents and their children. How many parents out there listening to this now have actually had a very open conversation with their children about sex? How many parents actually know for sure when their child first had sex and who with? And did their child then come to them and tell them they'd had sex? And did they tell them what it was like, what they enjoyed about it, what they didn't enjoy about it? You know, this is possible. Parents can get this information. If you've got a very open relationship with your child, you can get this from your child. The child, you don't have to interrogate them; they'll give it willingly. But if you have that sort of relationship, then great. I know many parents do have, because I've had students myself who've told me that they have that sort of relationship with the parents, but they are a minority.
But if the parents don't have that open relationship at the moment, what advice do you have to encourage that?
Okay.
To encourage the Actually, I was going to say to encourage the students to be open, but that's not true, because it's a partnership thing, isn't it? It works both ways.
The key is, the issue here is not with the child. The issue here is with the parent. And to get to a stage where your child is sexually open with you, telling you about their relationships, their loves, their fears, their anxieties, their experiences, which is very, very important if you can get to that, because then you can be supportive, you see, as a parent, if you understand what's going on. If your child's not telling you anything, you're always going to be in the dark, and that's difficult. However, to get to that position, you have to move from being what I call a parent to being a parent pal. And the critical years are from about 13 onwards. Childhood now is a short spell. You know, the active childhood starts at about 2, finishes about 10 or 11 or 12. Soon as a young boy or girl's into puberty, then the issues of sex and sexuality kick in, and by the time they're 16, a large number of young people have already started to have sex. So as the child grows into adolescence, your parenting tactics have to be different. You have to stop trying to control the child, but you still create boundaries and expectations under which the child has to operate and live. But you have to give more freedom. You have to have more conversations. You have to have more openness. You have to have more sharing. And certainly by the time that child is 17 or 18, you want to be a friend to that child.
Yes.
You'll never stop being the parent, and the child will never stop hopefully respecting your judgment and what on them. But you have to move to a situation of being open, and that can only do if you've moved to a position of friendship. Eventually, as the child gets into their 20s and 30s, you definitely need to be in a position of friendship, because otherwise there'll be no communication between you. Or there will be communication, but it'll be so limited as to be meaningless. And the difficulty is when children leave home, certainly when they go off to university, you often find that when they go back home, obviously periodically, and often children or students have said to me, okay, I do like going back home, but not that for that long, because when I go back home, I've got to go back and start living out as a 15 or 16-year-old, and not
Yes.
a 22-year-old.
Yes.
That's because the parents haven't moved on with the child, you see. The parents got to adapt.
Yes.
Parenting is not one pattern. It's not predictive over what you're doing as a parent when the child's 2. It's got to be very different when the child's 22, and very different from when the child's 13 to when the child's 18. These are very important and formative years, and the parents got to develop alongside it.
It sounds like the next book after the Relationship Manifesto is going to be Survival Skills for Parents.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's increasingly difficult, isn't it? I mean, I've got 6 children, 4 biological children aged between 13 and 37. I've got a stepdaughter, a Thai stepdaughter who's 11, and I've got an adopted Thai son who's just had his 12th birthday yesterday. I've learned a lot, and I have to say I've learned a lot from it in almost a haphazard way, unplanned way, but I also seen the consequences of parenting, whereby the children are not able to communicate with their mum and dad, and that's very sad, because it's sad for the kids, because the kids feel alone, and that's a danger then, that these sorts of situations where the child is not able to build a close and intimate relationship with the parents, because the parents are trying to control, limit,
Yes.
or are fearful of letting go. Though that's the situation when the child is more likely to get into a negative, difficult relationship. They'll move from the home into a relationship.
Yes.
Before they're ready for it.
Mm. It's interesting. This is the first. This is chapter 7 in the book, and called "What is Your Problem with Sex?" as a reminder. It's interesting that we've come across a chapter which has the word sex in it, and it's the longest podcast we've done yet. We've gone well over the time. We're almost on 40 minutes now.
Okay.
Stephen, before bringing it to a close, are there any points that we've missed that you'd want to say before we finish?
I'll do something which I know you like, Chris. I'm now going to do the bullet point. So, bullet point 1: don't commit to a relationship expecting to only have sex with that one person for the rest of your life, which in many cases might be for over half a century. Accept this fact and deal with it from the outset, and that means talking openly with your partner about your needs and hers. That's 1. 2, be honest with yourself about your sex needs and distinguish them from your love needs. And in this book, I'll help you do that. Number 3, if your partner reveals that he or she has had sex with someone else, The first question you will likely ask is, who is it? But this is an ego question. It's not that important. The two most important questions are, 1, do you love that someone else? 2, do you want to leave? And if the answer to both these last questions is yes, then let your partner go. 4, do not make any demands on your partner that he or she cannot follow through with. For example, many women will tell the partner that if he has sex with someone else, then the relationship is over. This is a control device meant to ensure the man's fidelity. Of course, it rarely works. All the man does is not tell. Now, I ask women, the ones who often lay this down, which would you prefer, to know or to not know? That is the only question, and only you can answer that. But be aware that if you impose this condition in the relationship, i.e. that you'll leave if the man has sex with someone else, then you have to follow through with it in the event that he is unfaithful. Is this what you truly want? Are you really sure you are prepared to end a relationship over sex? To me, if you're in a long-term relationship, you've invested a lot of time and energy and love and commitment in it, not least having the children as well, I think it's a big call.
Actually, that's great. That's very clear advice. And it's not. I know you tease me about my bullet points, but in my own head, I can see those now, and they're good guidelines. And in fact, everything you're doing is really guidelines, isn't it?
It's
not. There isn't going to be a test next week.
No, it's not. I'm not trying to be prescriptive. They are guidelines. People work it out for themselves in the end.
Yes. So I think on that note, it would be good to bring this to a close. So this is the end of episode 8 in the podcast series. And we finished looking at chapter 7. What is your problem with sex? Now, next weekend, we're going to look at the chapter 8 in the book, which is called "Women Have Changed, Have You?" Stephen, thanks very much for that.
Thanks, Chris.
It's very interesting. It is a bit challenging. It's very challenging, actually, because it's such a shift in society that, wow, it's... I wish I had my time machine and could sort of zip forward 40 years and look back and see actually, what's happened.
Yeah, it's phenomenal.
It is. Phenomenal. So thanks very much, and I hope, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, you've enjoyed listening to that. Please, as normal, visit the blog, relationshipmanifesto.posterous.com. And leave some comments, leave your views, support or disbeliefs, whatever your views are, they're important, and we'll read them. So see you next week. Have fun.